3 years ago, I left such a strange job that I struggled to talk about it for a long time. We're going to check some orders at the factory. In fact, every time someone asked me what I did for a living, I had to make up an answer because I didn't even know how to explain it myself. At least until today. That's why, in this video, I want to share the truth about my only job in China. From how I got it and how much I was paid, to how and why I was let go. I'll try to keep it brief, but I can't promise anything because we're talking about the first 4 years that Noelia and I spent in this country, so make yourselves comfortable. Before I start with our story, I want to pause to talk to you about something that completely changed my life, and as you watch the video, you'll realize that. In the first job I had in China, I faced a lot of difficulties and obstacles that at one point put me in a pretty dark place. And not because the job was bad or because I was in a bad place, but because that position wasn't compatible with my skills or my personality and therefore my time at that company. It was a tough 3.5 years, which although they put both Noelia and me to the test, eventually made us stronger and gave us the motivation to do all the things we've done. Since then and now, I'm sure many people who, when watching this video, will relate to the feeling of being in a job that really has nothing to do with who you are as a person, or that it's too late to change direction. The truth is that nowadays there are so many options thanks to the internet and the digital world. To start with this story, I think it's important to give you a bit of context about why both my family and I became obsessed with this country. It all started in 1998 when my mother became obsessed with the Oriental art of Feng Shui. This is a discipline focused on manipulating and understanding the energies of the universe so that you can transform your present. I honestly don't understand this much, so look it up on the internet. The point is that back then my mother wanted to take a Feng Shui course and she found one in southern China. Because of that, both she and my father went on a trip that lasted about a month and a half, during which they visited some of the most important places in the country. From that moment on, my parents came back with an obsession that I can't even describe. And it was present at every family meal, every gathering, every dinner. My parents would bombard us with stories about China, and I remember they would constantly tell us that China was the future, that it was a sleeping dragon, and that if we wanted to succeed in life, we would eventually need to learn the language and move there for opportunities. Of course, back then we were 10 or 12 years old and we had absolutely no interest at all, so the message became boring and repetitive. However, a few years later, and just a year before the Beijing Olympics, my parents took us on our first trip to China. And from that moment on, we finally understood the reason for their obsession, and as you may have seen in our videos. Traveling to China feels like visiting a different planet and is unlike anything you'll see elsewhere. And from that trip, we were totally hooked. I remember coming back and telling all my friends that one day I was going to move to China. I didn't know how or why I'd do it. And interestingly, a few years later, one of my best friends started showing interest in going to study a semester of Mandarin Chinese in the city of Shanghai. And honestly, if it hadn't been because she wanted to go, I probably never would have dared to take the leap. However, she's a very proactive girl, and by the time she told me, she already had the school. The admission letter already had all the details, and all I had to do was follow along. And the next thing I knew, I was already in the city of Shanghai. I spent a semester there supposedly studying Chinese, but honestly, at 19 years old, living in a city as big as Shanghai, well, I lost control. I spent my time partying, playing basketball, and barely prioritized Chinese. Therefore, my parents decided it was a waste of time and money and forced me to return to Mexico, where I started studying law. But why, if my dream was to go back to China, did I choose law, you might ask? Well, back then, at the time, a friend of my dad advised that if I truly wanted to return to China, I should pick a career with more flexibility. At first, I considered international relations or trade. But my dad's friend told me that if I chose law, I could eventually specialize in one of those fields. If I realized I didn't like it during the process, I could switch to something else like criminal or civil law. I could litigate, work at a notary office, and keep my options open. However, as time went by, it only strengthened my conviction, which honestly had already become a whim. So I always said, I'm going to come back, I'm going to come back, I'm going to come back. And in fact, the first times I went out with Noelia, I told her, I'm not sure we can last since I'm graduating next year and plan to return to China. So maybe it would be better for us to stay friends and keep things peaceful. I didn't know back then. It's just that from the day of my graduation, it would still take 3 to 4 years before I could officially return as an employee at a Chinese company. During that time, I spent my days traveling and volunteering around the world, which interestingly enough gave me the tools I would need to come back. And actually, one of those volunteer experiences took me back to China, where I spent 2 months on a pig farm studying Mandarin Chinese. When I ran out of money, I had to return to Mexico City. Before that, I had to fly to Shanghai, where my friend Danny worked at a local company. And once again, she was the one who completely changed my life, because while I was there, she told me how she managed to get a job in China and even recommended the agency to me, which eventually ended up finding me a job in the city of Suzhou. But from this point on, the story takes off. It's just that when I returned to Mexico and started having my first job interviews, I realized that most of the opportunities I was finding at the agency had nothing to do with my career. Among them, she sent me a proposal to work at a steel plant, another to work at a hotel, and finally one to work at a packaging solutions company in the city of Suzhou. This seemed quite strange to me because, as I mentioned before, I had graduated with a degree in law and none of these options had anything to do with it. However, at that time, I was willing to accept anything that would allow me to return to China with a work visa and continue looking for opportunities. Therefore, on June 6, 2019, I had my first job interview. And probably from that moment, I should have realized that something wasn't quite right. The thing is, during a regular job interview, questions about the position are relevant. However, during my interview, they asked me some very strange questions, and among them, the one that caught my attention the most was about my ability to handle alcohol, or in other words, how much I could drink. And at this moment, I would like to know what you would have answered, because even though I'm someone who likes to have fun, up to that point I had never counted how much alcohol I could drink before hitting the floor. What I didn't know is that in China, this is something very important for business people, since many times deals are made at the table with a good drink. Since I didn't know any of that, I just answered, I don't know how much I can drink. And a few months later, I found out that that answer practically got me the job because they interpreted it as a sign that I could drink a lot. Once the interview was over, not even 3 days had passed when I received the job offer, and the main salary package was as follows. They offered me 14,000 yuan, which at the exchange rate back then was about 34,000 Mexican pesos. Plus a little money to rent an apartment and 3 meals a day, which is pretty common in any Chinese company. The only requirement was that I had to be in China as soon as possible. So I immediately started doing all my paperwork, validating all my documents. And on October 3rd, 2019, accompanied by my brother and my cousin, I finally moved to the city of Suzhou. The arrival was very strange, but that was just the beginning of a series of events that kept surprising me more and more. To begin with, we chose one of the worst dates to fly to China since we did it during the National Day holidays. Therefore, when we arrived in China, there was no one from the company to receive me since everyone was on vacation. And we basically had to learn how to get around the city and find the company on our own. I remember thinking we were moving to one of those well-known abandoned cities when we arrived in Suzhou. Since it's such a huge industrial park, most people leave during the holidays, and when we arrived it was empty. However, a few days later the holiday period ended and I finally had my first official day at work. At that time, I was living in a hotel and my boss offered to pick me up. As expected, I wanted to make a good first impression. So I put on my best suit, wore a tie, polished my shoes, and even put on a little cologne. Only to find out that my boss was wearing basketball shorts and was dressed as if he had just come from a game, but it gets better. Because when we arrived at the company, there was a sort of welcoming committee where my co-workers welcomed me, even with a huge banner that said, "Welcome new co-worker." Then they showed me around the company. But what a surprise I got when I realized that the only person who spoke English in the whole company was my boss. And when I say speak English, I mean he spoke about 50 or 60% English, and for the rest we had to use a translator. Once the tour ended, they introduced me to my co-workers and gave me my office. The strangest period of my life began. You're probably wondering what a Mexican lawyer is doing working at a Chinese packaging company. I wonder that myself too. At first, I remember my boss assigned me a mentor and told me he would teach me how the company worked, what my responsibilities were, and what things I needed to learn in order to integrate into the company. However, this mentor didn't speak English, or at least not enough to explain to me such technical things as the ones I was supposed to study. And at the same time, my Chinese was very far from the level needed to understand that industry. And at the same time, the people who work there are engineers who spent their entire university careers learning about the industry. And therefore, from the very first day, I got the impression that this job wasn't going to last very long. I remember that in the first week, I began exploring other options, sending out job applications and contacting the agency again. This time she refused to help me because I hadn't paid her commission yet. We had agreed I would pay her my first 3 months' salary for finding me that job. And obviously it wasn't in her best interest for me to change jobs immediately before covering the expenses, so I had no choice but to start tightening my belt. I started studying Chinese between 4 and 6 hours a day and tried to practice it with my co-workers. And in this situation, you probably think it would be very easy to learn since you're surrounded by the right environment and you can practice with anyone. But you have to keep in mind that my co-workers weren't paid to be my teachers. They were busy doing their own things. Honestly, Chinese people have a brutal work pace, so as days went by, I started to realize that I was becoming a burden. And the thing is, when I went down during lunchtime and tried to make conversation with my co-workers, the first few days they were patient with me. They answered me. They were curious and asked me questions. But as the weeks went by, the novelty wore off. And then talking to me became more of a bother. Because the Chinese usually come down at lunchtime, eat in 5 minutes, take a walk around the company, and then take a nap to recover their energy. However, the unfortunate person who had to sit near me basically had to become my teacher for the entire lunch break. And that's why, as days went by, I started to realize that my coworkers were avoiding me, and over time I started avoiding them too. I remember reaching a point where I stopped going down for lunch and just waited until everyone was done eating. Sometimes I'd take my container, serve myself, and eat alone in my office. But not everything was completely bad, because even though I couldn't communicate with my coworkers outside of work hours at the company, I had started to make a group of Mexican friends with whom I got along very well. In fact, I still remember that we even celebrated Halloween and the Day of the Dead. We did some things here and there, and so I just had to survive my 8 hours of work so I could go out and have fun like anyone else would. But then the pandemic broke out and things got much worse. From that moment on, most of my friends went back to Mexico, and when China closed its borders, they couldn't come back. But on top of that, quarantines and restrictions started and the shopping malls closed. And beyond your coworkers, there was no way to meet other people. Therefore, I had no choice but to focus on my work and on surviving until I could find something better. It was already clear to me that I couldn't find other opportunities during the pandemic. So I focused most of my time on studying Mandarin Chinese so I could adapt to the company I was working at. The isolation period lasted for about 2 months, and then we were able to return to the office where I was informed that the project I had didn't come to a good end. So they needed to find me a new one, and that's when they assigned me to the sales department. At first, it seemed like a pretty positive thing to me because originally I had joined that company to train as a key account manager. Since the company was planning to open a factory in Tijuana and they wanted me to take charge of the relationship between the headquarters and the factory in Mexico. In my new position, things were much clearer. Find clients. However, the excitement didn't last long because my boss singled me out. in some training sessions that were completely in Mandarin Chinese. And I still remember that after the first training session, I went to his office and said, "Hey, they're in Mandarin Chinese, how am I supposed to learn?" To which he replied, "You've already been in China for almost half a year, you should at least be able to understand the basic concepts by now. But keep in mind that these weren't just any training sessions, you had to learn terms and words Chinese people learn in university. Since I didn't know this, I took it seriously. I ended up tripling my Chinese study hours and learned concepts I don't even remember now since they're not words used in daily life. But the important thing is that thanks to these courses, I realized that it was going to be impossible, that this job would eventually come to an end, and that I probably wouldn't even survive the next 3 months. Therefore, I started looking for all kinds of options, from searching for another job to investing in Bitcoin. Many thoughts crossed my mind until I decided to start a YouTube channel. From that moment on, Noelia and I put all our effort into growing our YouTube channel so that eventually it could become an alternative. Especially because we were operating under the idea that my original contract, which was for 1 year, was not going to be renewed. I remember telling Noelia, if nothing else works, they'll fire me and we'll have no income or visa. We were both very afraid, knowing it would be hard to find a job in Mexico during the pandemic. From that moment on, Noelia and I started looking for alternatives, and she found a job as an English teacher at a kindergarten. However, back then we had no idea that we were doing something illegal. The thing is, the fact that I had a work visa didn't allow Noelia to earn income in China. However, back then we were operating under the idea that my contract wouldn't be renewed and that we would have to survive on our savings for an indefinite period of time. Therefore, from then on, Noelia and I started saving as if there were no tomorrow. And just to give you an idea of how obsessed we were with saving every penny, for a long time, I brought a container to the company to get a double portion for Noelia and me to have for dinner. Over time, our YouTube channel started to grow when we reached our first 5,000 subscribers. We were invited on a trip to the city of Xi'an, where we met many other content creators who were already working professionally in the industry. And even though our channel wasn't generating any income yet, it was thanks to it and our innocence that we started to believe the project was possible. Therefore, when we returned from that trip, Noelia and I made the decision for her to leave her job so she could dedicate herself full-time to editing our videos. In retrospect, this was a very unwise decision because, as I mentioned before, we felt that I was about to lose my job. And the world was in a pandemic, so it wouldn't have been easy to find an alternative. Luckily, we trusted our instincts, and as a result, the channel gradually grew. However, and against all our expectations, when the channel was finally starting to gain a bit of traction, I was called to renew my contract. I still remember that I was shocked because until then, I really hadn't had any real usefulness for the company. I saw no future in our relationship. I still didn't have the necessary command of the language to work in that industry, and honestly, I couldn't find my value within that company. However, my boss saw it differently because he offered to renew my contract not for 1 year but for 3. As expected, I didn't hesitate, I signed immediately, and I remember going home to celebrate with Noelia that we weren't gonna get kicked out and that, at least for the next 2 or 3 months, we wouldn't have to worry. But I still had the conviction that it couldn't last. And if you had been in my situation, you probably would have felt the same way. And for you to understand, I have to tell you what I was actually doing in the company. As I mentioned before, they had moved me to the sales position. They gave me several trainings in Chinese that I couldn't understand or translate, so nothing stayed with me. However, after signing my second contract, they did start giving me more tasks, including learning all the company's information in English, making PowerPoint presentations, and accompanying my boss on business trips during which I would present the company to audiences of up to 50 to 100 people. However, as time went by, I started to realize that there was something quite strange. And it was that every time we received a client or visited a company and I gave my presentations, I realized that 99% of the people I was introducing myself to didn't understand me at all. And usually these presentations were followed by business dinners where you had to drink and generally socialize with the clients. And little by little, I started to realize that this was my new and true role. The truth is, I wasn't there to present anything at all, but just to be there. As a corporate entity, as a way to attract the attention of our client. At first, this was just a suspicion, but as time went by, I started to realize that they were giving me completely irrelevant tasks. And although at first I tried to complete all of them, eventually I started to realize that many times not even my boss remembered what he had assigned to me. He never checked my work. I was sometimes absent without anyone noticing, and eventually I had to accept it. I was nothing more than a corporate mascot who really had no future within the company, other than drinking at business dinners and making my boss look good. And these dinners are quite a phenomenon. Basically, my role in them was to act as a shield so my boss wouldn't get drunk and to be part of the entertainment. And even though it sounds like a simple task, getting paid to go party with business people, the truth is that they happen so often that sometimes you don't even have time to recover. On the other hand, the pressure to drink is sometimes very strong. In fact, at some point, Noelia had to put up with me arriving in the arms of a co-worker whose name I don't even remember. As you can imagine, this situation was unsustainable. That's why Noelia and I decided to double down on our efforts on YouTube until eventually our project started to take off. However, this meant that I had to neglect my job more and more, that I couldn't attend business trips, and that I had to start making up illnesses. So I could go out and film, to accept the first invitations we had to events related to content creation. Initially, I recall my boss being open and very supportive. However, eventually he called me into his office to ask me what was going on and what my plans for the future were. He already knew I was deeply involved in my personal project. Initially, I told him that I was going to do everything possible to balance both projects, but from that moment on, I knew my days were numbered. Shortly after, he called me back to his office where he waited for me with my resignation letter, and in the kindest way possible, he asked me to sign it. At that time, I had no objection. I remember that I thanked him a lot for being patient with me and for supporting me during the pandemic. And I just asked him to give me a day to process what was happening and what I was going to do after resigning, and you won't believe it That same afternoon during a soccer game, I had an accident in which I broke my right foot, and when I went to the doctor, I found out that I was going to need surgery. Because of that, the next day I couldn't go sign the resignation, and later when I called my mother to tell her what was happening, that I had basically just been fired, and that I needed surgery in a country whose rules I didn't understand, she told me, "No, wait, don't sign anything, they can't fire you. Now that you need this surgery, ask your boss as a favor to give you a few months to recover, because the recovery process for this surgery is 4 months." And sure enough, during a call with my boss, I told him about the situation. I told him I was going to need surgery, and fortunately he was willing to support me. He said there would be no problem for the next 4 months. I would keep receiving my pay, and they would keep my visa until year end. Thanks to that, I haven't read. I had the necessary time to go back to Mexico, to restructure everything we were doing, to get married, and to look for an alternative. And if you've ever been fired or quit your job or tried to start a project, you probably understand the feeling of loneliness or emptiness that comes when you have to start figuring things out on your own. That exact feeling overwhelmed Noelia and me. And the thing is, in school, nobody teaches you how to manage your time, how to handle your finances, how to run your business, or how to do all those things that are required to work for yourself. From this point on, Noelia and I had to fend for ourselves and find a way to stay in the country. Fortunately, during the transition process, we met the owners of a school who invited us to spend a year studying Chinese in the mountains of Yangshuo. And it was thanks to them that we were able to have a visa for the next 365 days to stay in the country, and later we ended up opening our own company. And the rest is history. But for me, it's very nice to remember that time because honestly, it wasn't easy. Those were times of a lot of loneliness when Noelia and I didn't have any friends and we dedicated all our time to working. Whether it was on the channel, at kindergarten, or preparing the presentations I had to give for the company. However, looking back, I realized that if we hadn't had to go through all those things, we probably never would have reached the point where we are today. And that's why I want to take this video as an opportunity to remind you that if you're going through a tough time, it's probably just the transition process towards something better. And the thing is, without mud, there is no lotus, and this flower can't grow without the mud, which is considered something dirty, something smelly, something undesirable. However, it's precisely there where one of the most beautiful and most revered flowers in the entire world is born. Finally, I want to remind you that if you are interested in exploring an opportunity that allows you to work from anywhere in the world, you can scan this quick response code to access a WhatsApp group where you will receive the first lesson on digital nomadism. We hope this becomes the first of many steps that will allow you to have the job of your dreams. So remember that. If you are going through a tough time, you are probably in a formative stage that will lead you to a much better future. I want to close the video with a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you, especially if you have been with us since the very beginning. What often seemed like a smile was actually desperation in disguise. And if it hadn't been for all of you and the unconditional support you've given us, we would have never made it to where we are today. But anyway, I'll see you in the next short video or live stream. And from my beautiful city of Metepec, I send you a big hug and wish you the best year in 2026.